Good morning. My name is Maria Majuka, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Pro Humanitate Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to Day 2 of Rethinking Community Conference. For those of you that were with us yesterday, we had a very spirited day of conversations about the role of universities in the community, and also conversations about freedom of speech, safe space, and how to engage within our campus community. So today's focus really does turn to thinking a bit more about critical partnerships that we can create within our communities as university institutions. And so the first panel today will get us thinking in that direction. Shelley Sizemore, Director of Academic Programs and Community Engaged Research, will introduce the panel.
First, I'm going to put the microphones on the chairs because I forgot to do that before Mary Ann welcomed. All right, so I'm very excited to welcome our first panel today. I'll introduce each of our guests and our moderator, and they'll join us on stage. Dr. Joanne Banks is the Bertha L. Shelton Endowed Professor for Research and Professor of Nursing at Winston-Salem State University. She came to Winston-Salem State in 2008 from the University of Missouri-Columbia, where she was an Associate Professor of Nursing and Women's Studies. Dr. Banks has been a registered nurse for 36 years and taught in higher education for 28 years. Her research focuses on storytelling and physical activity as strategies to promote the health and well-being of Black women. The desire to assist in the development of a more ethnically diverse nursing workforce is what led her to accept her first appointment at an HBCU. She has just completed her third year as a faculty in residence in Foundation Heights at Winston-Salem State. Dr. Banks also serves as the faculty liaison for Women in Science and Health. The purpose of this living learning community is to facilitate the academic, social, and professional development of undergraduates pursuing degrees in science and health fields. Dr. Banks is also the founder and facilitator of the Qualitative Research Interest Group, which is open to students, faculty, and staff interested in qualitative research. She is married to Dr. Russell Benjamin, who is a professor of political science and has one adult son, William, who is an artist living in Philadelphia. Welcome, Dr. Banks. Great. Yes. Leslie Garvin is the Executive Director of North Carolina Campus Compact, a collaborative network of 38 colleges and universities with a shared commitment to educating engaged citizens and strengthening communities. Garvin became the Executive Director in 2014 after serving as the Associate Director for over 9 years. She serves as the liaison to the 10-member executive board comprised of presidents and chancellors and brings strategic partnerships to develop and expand higher education civic engagement. Since joining the compact, Garvin has played a key role in starting or expanding the network's community service and professional development programming. She has served as program director on 3 AmeriCorps grants that engaged hundreds of college students in community service, and for 8 years she has managed grants to support the Martin Luther King Day of Service activities on 180 campuses across the Southeast. She developed the Campus Election Engagement Project North Carolina, the Civic Engagement Statewide Awards Program, and acts as lead coordinator for the Compact's 3 major civic engagement conferences and biannual network meetings, which together attract nearly 700 participants each year. Prior to joining North Carolina Campus Compact, Garvin worked in the interfaith and community leadership development fields in St. Louis, Missouri. Garvin is also a proud AmeriCorps alumni. She serves on the board of the United Way of Greater High Point and on the Service Year Advisory Council and the Advisory Committee on Civic Health for the Institute for Emerging Issues. She holds 2 degrees from Washington University in St. Louis, a Bachelor of Arts with college honors with majors in political science and African American studies, and a Master's of Social Work with a concentration on social and economic development. Welcome, Leslie Garvin. Dr. Charlotte Williams is Associate Professor of Public Health and Director of the Center on Community Philanthropy at the University of Arkansas Clinton School of Public Service. The center is dedicated to expanding the knowledge, tools, and practice of community-spawned and community-driven philanthropy. As a champion of building communities into places where all people can thrive, Williams leads the center's work on Arkansas and the region that lifts up community philanthropy as a powerful influence for turning communities toward positive change. Williams is responsible for launching the center in its core work areas of leadership, scholarship, research, and convening. Williams develops and manages key projects of the center that focus on building community-based solutions and programs dedicated to eliminating disparities and promoting social justice. She has developed and teaches a course on community philanthropy for graduate students at the Clinton School. Williams has co-authored a book entitled Passing the Torch, Planning for the Next Generation of Leaders in Public Service. The book features an analysis of succession planning across a variety of nonprofit organizations and examines what will motivate the next generation of public servants. As a community and civic leader, Williams serves on the University of Arkansas at Little Rock Chancellor's Committee on Race and Ethnicity. She is also an advisory board member of Circles USA. She holds an adjunct faculty appointment in the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences Offices of Global Health, and is associate faculty with the University of Arkansas at Little Rock Institute on Race and Ethnicity. A business administration graduate from Howard University in Washington, D.C., Williams earned her doctoral degree in public health and her master's degree in public health from the University of Arkansas, the UAMS College of Public Health. In her academic research experience, she has extensively studied and published papers on several peer-reviewed journals, including Academic Medicine, the Journal of Communication, and the Journal of Nonprofit Management and Leadership. Welcome, Dr. Williams. And finally, our moderator, James Perry. James Perry is president and CEO of the Winston-Salem Urban League. Perry leads a near 20-person team across the North Carolina Triad, advocating for civil rights, employment, and opportunities, affordable housing, health and wellness, voting rights, food security, and more. Before taking charge of the Urban League, Perry served for 10 years as the chief executive officer of the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center. Perry led the center through Hurricane Katrina, the most disastrous hurricane to make landfall in America. Under his leadership, the center won more than $500 million for victims of discrimination across Louisiana. Perry founded the Mississippi Gulf Coast Fair Housing Center, testified before Congress 8 times, and has served on dozens of local, state, and national boards and commissions. He currently serves on the National Fair Housing Alliance Board of Directors. Perry is a political science graduate of the University of New Orleans and a graduate of the Loyola University School of Law. Perry and his wife, Melissa Harris Perry, are raising 2 daughters in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Let's welcome our panelists one last time.
Good morning. How's everyone doing? All right, did everyone have enough coffee? All right, so we want to have a fun and rousing conversation, and one that hopefully wakes everyone up, because I said, did everyone have enough coffee? I saw like a few thumbs go up, but no one was like, yeah, I had enough coffee, right? So I want to start by thanking the planners of this incredible event. I want to thank you, Jim. I'm a great admirer of your work, and I think you're very brave to step forward and host this event. Thank you so very, very much. I also want to thank your co-host, who I happen to think is much more attractive than you, but who also is very, very brave, and that, of course, is my wife, Melissa. But let's jump into this. Before we get into our discussion, I want to ask each of you to take 5 minutes and just tell us about the work that you do, to give us all a baseline, and then let's have a bit of a discussion. So, Dr. Banks, let's start with you.
Oh, okay.
And before you get started, I want to share with the audience that as I took a selfie of the panel just now, Dr. Banks let us know that was her first selfie ever. All right? So give Dr. Banks a round of applause, and let's see how many other firsts we're able to have in the course of this panel. Dr. Banks?
I just wanted to tell some stories today. I didn't. So, but the work I do, I guess I have to preface it by saying that everything that I know and everything that I am, I have to give praise and thanks to the people of Allgale Gardens in Chicago, where I grew up. Allgale Gardens is what I learned when I went to school, a notorious housing project. But it is the place where I learned what it was to love and care for one another. I am here in Winston-Salem by the grace of the Spirit. I worked for 15 years at research institutions, having grown up like many of us with the notion that you go to these institutions, you go to the best institutions so that you can be a quote-unquote success. And so I had the opportunity to go to some of the best institutions in our country. And then I worked in research institutions for 15 years. And that was great for me as a person interested in developing herself as a scholar. It was horrible for me in terms of actually getting to work with people who I was interested in developing as a scholar. Because in those 15 years, I didn't have 15 non-white students. And as everyone in the room knows, we've got a problem in this country with respect to what we're calling now health disparities. We could just call them generalized inequities in social conditions and disrespect for people. And so after 15 years, I said, I have got to, if I'm going to be about really doing something about health promotion, I have to get myself to a place where I can actually work with people on the forefront, because when I say I didn't have 15 non-white students, let me also say I never had a non-white colleague in those 15 years either. And so just trying to even talk about the ideals that were important to me were a challenge. And it happened that one of my former mentees came to visit me, and her sister was with her, and she had come from Winston-Salem State. And she said, have you considered Winston-Salem State? And I had never heard of Winston-Salem State because in the community where I grew up, we didn't talk about HBCUs, so I was literally starting from nowhere. So I came here, I fell in love with the vision, and I've been here, this is my 10th year. And so my work is really preparing people, because I think that not only do we need clinicians, but more importantly, as I think about how we're going to do the work, we have to change everything about how we do the work. We have to change how we conceptualize what it is to be well and what it means to work with people to be well. And so that's where my work has been, creating the scholars at every level. And Winston-Salem State is so about community that they're pushing me. And so one of the things that I noticed, though, was that we were getting no students. Nursing is the biggest program at WSSU. And we were getting no students who had started as freshmen into the nursing program. 75 to 80% of our students coming into the nursing program were transfer students. And so for the last 5 years, I've been living on campus. I was the first faculty in residence, as they said, and I moved on campus so that I could speak on a day-to-day basis and be infused with what it means to be a student. And so that's where I am.
Okay, I work with Campus Compact, and we are a coalition of colleges and universities. We were founded 31 years ago by the presidents of Stanford, Brown, Georgetown, and the Education Commission of the States. If you think about the 80s, this was a time when people were calling that cohort that was coming through school the me generation. And so these presidents wanted to push back against that concept. They also wanted to self-reflect about what had they done to counter that. So they made a compact amongst themselves, a promise that as far as it dwelled within them, they were going to commit their institutions to the public ideals of higher education. The idea that we are there to preserve, promote democracy, prepare students for life of civic responsibility, and that we had a responsibility to the communities where we were located. Presidents around the country started to hear about it, and they decided, you know, we want to make a compact amongst ourselves. So today, Campus Compact serves 38 states through 34 state and regional offices. In North Carolina, unfortunately, the South is, when you think of those 38 states, if you look at the map, you'll realize where the gaps are. So we were a little bit late to the table, still trying to develop here. So 15 years ago, the presidents of North Carolina decided, you know, we want to get on board with this notion. And so it was led by Leo Lambert, the outgoing president of Elon University. He said, I'm so committed to this, I'll host a state office. So that's where we are. Today, there are 38 campuses throughout the state who are part of our compact. We're the only organization that brings together all three sectors. So we have 4-year public-private. We also have community colleges. And I'm pleased to say that the North Carolina Community College System Office is actually became a member this year. And so our work at the state office is to help the campuses actually live this out. I come to this work having been on the other side of the fence. I was a community partner. And so in terms of stories, I have lots of stories I could tell you about how this can be done not well. And I'll tell you one. So I was doing work, I came to higher education as a community partner. I was doing organizing a community development work in low wealth communities, high asset communities, low wealth. And when I first got to an area, a place called Washington Park, Illinois, next to East St. Louis, Illinois, you may have heard of it, 42% poverty rate, 20% unemployment. So I walked in and I said, I'm with you for a year. I'm here with the community, in partnership with the community to see how together we can make a difference. And you're leading the way. And the mayor was really, really skeptical, and he invited me into his office, and because again, I was representing a university. He said, you see this wall behind me? You see those 3 binders, about this thick? He said, those are studies that were conducted by 3 universities on this community. They came, they used us as a lab, and then they left. Another story, I led our internship practicum initiatives at the organization where I was. I worked with 4 campuses, 1 seminary, and I only had 1 orientation at one of those schools for 1 hour to be a placement site for those practicum and intern students. And I was responsible for managing them, holding them accountable, doing all those sorts of things. I signed time logs, and so when it went really, really well, it was amazing. I had some amazing young folks who were driven and who were in the community, understood it. I had some that really were not, didn't understand cultural humility. They were doing more harm than good in those communities. And then my final story is that I would also, in those communities, do community projects, episodic, where we would, if the community said we want to build, we want to restore housing, we want to build a playground, so we would invite volunteers to help. Often I would have universities sign up. I'm going to have 20 students there on Saturday, and I would hustle. I'd get the rest of my grant money, I'd go get all of my supplies, I'd call Parks and Rec, and I would hustle, 5 students would show up. So I come to this work as a skeptical warrior. I believe in the promise of higher education, that we are anchor institutions. We have a responsibility to communities where we are. We are the community. Community is what is community. Universities are the community, and we have a responsibility. I'm also skeptical about the effectiveness of that. So my hope with our organization in North Carolina is to help our campuses do this in a way that's just, equitable, and that really honors, that we don't give lip service to partnership, that we understand that it means to be authentic and in relationship.
Yeah, from the very beginning of the Clinton School, it was always intended that a focus on philanthropy would be a specific emphasis, particularly in the context of global public service. Because if you consider that the giving of your energies and your career to the betterment of mankind is kind of the generic definition of public service, then once you start adding your resources and your wealth to that, that takes that whole concept to a whole nother level. And when you consider that these southern states like Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi are some of the most impoverished states in the country, yet every year they rank at or near the top in charitable giving. So what that said to us was that we needed some kind of a descriptor, some kind of an adjective in front of this word philanthropy, so people didn't think we just meant the rich giving to the poor. So this concept of grassroots philanthropy or community philanthropy, which is a term, that's used by the Kellogg Foundation, by the Ford Foundation, it connotes that giving is a natural component of communal living, and it is a vital but very poorly understood aspect of public service. So at the Clinton School, we are exploring philanthropy in its broadest, most expansive way as benevolence in a community-centered, consensus-building approach to delivering public service, as a joining with others to advance some of the most basic humanitarian interests through community participatory process and civic engagement. So we're not looking at philanthropy the way the traditional world looks at philanthropy, as external investment from the outside in. We are looking at and researching and studying about the kind of giving from within communities, where we're looking at the assets and the values that exist within community, and how do you mobilize and organize and formalize that in a way that communities can drive the kind of change that they want to see happen. So our goal is to further understand it and further build it in a way that everybody can understand it and that communities can make a commitment to practicing community philanthropy to drive their environments into the kind of areas where they want to exist. Yeah.
So I want to start from something that you said. You said that giving is a key part of public service. Right? So the first question is, can taking be a key part of public service?
Well, taking in the context of taking your rights and taking your truth to power, I absolutely believe could be a part of public service. In the context of moving marginalized people from the margins into the mainstream, that would be a focus of how you could see taking in a positive aspect, right?
Well, let me push it in a different way. So, for instance, Dr. Garvin talked about this idea that the mayor said, well, look at all these studies behind me that the universities have come into my community and done. And now you want to come in and represent the university. Well, on the one hand, certainly that's, it felt like a waste of time to the mayor, right? But on the other hand, there's certainly some value in those studies, right? And so those communities, certainly at least that mayor felt taken advantage of, but is there some value in that taking?
So, as a person that was doing community work and I had students and universities helping, absolutely, right? I think that most communities will say, well, let me back up. The studies of community partners who work with campuses almost always are positive. Communities always say, yes, we're grateful you were there, and they don't really want to unpack sort of the negative possibilities because they recognize that there is some good that happens when they need the students to be there to paint the building. They need faculty to give the research for the grant. There is absolute value in doing this on its most minimal level. I can tell you, even on that minimal level, though, we could do harm. We could reinforce stereotypes when these students aren't prepared to go in the community. We can make them think you can ameliorate them with a Band-Aid when they don't look at the root causes, they don't look at the structures. So we're leading these students out into a world thinking that problems, hey, I signed up. I spent the day feeding the homeless. Homelessness is over. And so but yes, there is the positive, the absolute need for universities to be engaged on every level. But I guess my hope is that we can take it deeper, and that we can make more of a commitment, and that we can really start talking about structural change and social justice.
Okay, so I want to share this story that I actually wanted to start with. Because I think it speaks to how do we think differently about this. So, this is The Farmer and the Angel, and I'm reading it today because it just came to me, so I didn't get to prepare it to just tell. And it was adapted by John Porcino. There once was a very kind and joyful old farmer. He was 90 years old, and though his bones were a wee bit weary, his eyes still sparkled with love and laughter. He was the kind who seemed to know just what to say to make you smile. And when you needed to weep, he'd sit by your side and hold you. He was the kind who noticed the dew sparkling on a spider's web and knew the taste of a juicy red strawberry. He was the kind who still at 90 worked hard every day on the land, and when you needed a helping hand, his sleeves were ready to go. One day, because of his goodness, he was visited by an angel who granted him a wish. The angel told the old man that anything he wanted would be his. The farmer could have wished for anything, but instead he said to the angel, I am happy with the bounty of food upon my plate and the love that surrounds me daily. But before I die, I should like just once to see heaven and hell. The angel told him to take hold of her cloak, and in an instant they arrived at the gates of hell. To the surprise of the good man, when he passed through the gates, he found himself on the edge of a beautiful open green surrounded by tall, graceful pine trees. As he walked toward the middle of the green, he saw many people seated around a great long table that was heaped high with the most magnificent and delicious foods the man had ever seen. Yet, as he drew near, he saw that the people looked sickly and thin, as if they were wasting away from starvation. How could this be? Then he noticed that the people's arms were locked straight so that they could not bend them. It was impossible for these people to feed themselves. Ah! The man sighed. This is truly hell. Hastily he returned to the angel and took hold of her cloak. In another instant they arrived at the gates of heaven. Here too the good man found himself on the edge of a beautiful open green, surrounded by tall, majestic pine trees. He walked toward the middle of the green and saw many people seated around a great long table that was heaped high with the most wonderful and delicious foods. As he drew near, the men saw that the people's arms were locked straight, so they could not be bent. Yet these people were smiling and laughing. Their eyes danced with a merry delight, and their stomachs seemed joyfully content. How was this possible? The good man looked closer, and he saw the people of heaven were feeding each other. Ah, yes, smiled the good man with a knowing nod of his head. This is truly heaven. That's what we're all talking about, is how do we start with the community to help the community from the context in which they're really living to figure out how to move forward and for everybody to be healthy. And so,
Is that the obligation of a university?
it's an absolute obligation of the university because we are one. We are all connected. There's no such thing as part of society being healthy. And so if we all have different roles in that, and I think that, yes, I'll just stop it with that, yes.
Do we all agree? Is that an obligation of a college or university?
You know, I'll say that it's both an obligation and an opportunity for universities to ensure that there is both a pipeline and a bridge that exists within both the knowledge building, the learning, the training opportunities that exist on campus, and to create a pathway for opportunities to be engaged in that, as well as to ultimately grow up and send individuals to that community. I mean, universities are located just geographically in a setting where they have an opportunity to connect with universities on a lot of different levels. And that's one of the things our center does. It offers an opportunity for communities to connect with the university that traditionally they would not have unless they were giving scholarships or something like that. But our work does engage a research component of it, but the leadership development piece of it really is more about working with communities around their own priorities and helping them to understand this concept and how they can utilize it through mobilizing among themselves around this idea of change, particularly social change.
So I would say that, this is the skeptic in me, that the goal of university is to educate students for careers and for life. But I will also say, I mean, so the argument has been and could be made that, and particularly in North Carolina now, it is being made that we need to rate colleges on how many jobs folks are getting when they graduate and how much money they're making. And that is a fair desire. I don't think any of us, did anybody go to school not to work, not to have a good, so I recognize, I understand that argument, let me say that. I will also say at the same time, I've never visited a university, a president or a chancellor where it was not embedded in their mission that that was who they were supposed to be, meaning part of the community or serving the good or pro humanitate or whatever you want to call it. So I think they definitely recognize that role. I think often there are external forces that push them away from that.
So I'm sorry to harp on your comments, but I found
Harp
that
away.
I found that that concept of giving as a key part of public service very poignant, and so.
Actually, what I said is giving is a natural component of communal living.
Of communal living.
And it's a vital but poorly understood aspect of public service. So we're studying that.
So then I have stolen and bastardized it, and I apologize for that. And I apologize even more because I'm going to continue to bastardize it.
Okay.
To make it work with this, my next question here.
Okay.
Because this is the thing that I'm curious about. In order to do a lot of the things that we've talked about here, it takes money, yeah. Right? And this does come from this idea of giving, and so I am curious about when we're talking about giving in public service, about the connection, right? So at what point? When you're trying to connect to community, do you have to think about the source of the money? If the thing that you're trying to do for community is appropriate, or it is what the community seeks,
Yeah.
right? So what's is it still a public service if there are concerns about the source of the money?
Well, let me answer that by starting with how we define community philanthropy, okay? At the Center on Community, we define community philanthropy as the giving of time, talent, and treasure. That when you invest it locally, it's characteristic of positive change and lasting development. It's a process that helps communities recognize the power of what they're already giving, publicly, privately, personally, and then to envision a future that comes from sustaining those assets. So as an initial thing, community philanthropy is much more than just money. It includes money, but as you know, things of value exist in a lot of different forms, particularly at the population level. So this idea would be to consider the treasure piece, which would be the dollar piece. But not everybody might have dollars necessarily to bring to the table, but they have other forms of value that they can then bring to bear on change. So this idea of time and the value of time and what that means to struggling individuals, right? The idea of social capital, intellectual capital, cultural capital, political capital, economic capital. It's all forms of capital and how we can engage around a process and a strategy to utilize that, bringing everybody in the position of being able to be a philanthropist, regardless to dollar size.
Yes, I want to say something with respect to that. First of all, I have a friend and colleague who's at the University of Washington. Her name is Doris Boutan, and she's actually working with her community there around how to develop and sustain projects in the absence of grants. And because one of the things that she's
What's her phone number?
one of the things she's concerned about is what happens when we make our communities dependent
Absolutely.
on grants that come and go. And so she's doing some fascinating work. I want to say that. But the other thing that I want to say as we talk about this is that I think we need to figure out how to revalue what it is that the community is actually bringing. Okay? Because what the community knows is valuable on so many levels. We often want the communities to come in and give a flavor, and then we put together the grant where we spend 95% or more of the money funding ourselves and our staff at the university. And we leave the communities begging. So how do we really value and have community come in as the scholars that they are and pay them for real? You know, not play, not these $10, $100 stipends, but for real, to do the work. And I think that that's part of the discussion, that universities are systems that are so interested in perpetuating themselves that it requires communities to continue to be downtrodden. And so when we talk about philanthropy, I think we need to shift the conversation in some
or broaden the definition the way we are. You know, we're not talking about that traditional type of philanthropy. And you know, sister, you're absolutely right. The reality is that oftentimes communities don't have time to sit around and wait on a big grant to show up. They just don't have time for that. They have to engage and think about how to release their own creativity and the generosity that just naturally exists in community. And this piece, one of the things we do, as I talked about, is leadership development at the Center on Community Philanthropy. Now, when we say leadership development, we're talking about leaders, local folks who have got the knowledge, they have the expertise at the community level, and quite frankly, they have the credibility that the university does not have. How do we build their capacity for fundraising, facilities management, for all of that? Because we know that those folks live in those communities and they're going to be in that community. In fact, we often promote community philanthropy as citizenship. And what we mean by that is that the citizens who are going to benefit from that philanthropy, they are the drivers of that philanthropy, right? And so being engaged in community philanthropy becomes a civic duty, a civic opportunity, right? To give and to share and trade, not necessarily dollars, but with all of the commitment, it's around advancing equity. Equity.
So I'm going to give you all a sentence, all right? And it's going to be missing a word. And I'm going to ask you to insert the word that you think is appropriate, all right? And then explain why you inserted that word. So the sentence is, universities have a blank effect on community. All right. Universities have a blank effect on community. Whenever you're ready. Don't all jump at once.
I'm going to dive in here. I'm going to say that universities have a unique effect on communities. And I'm using the word unique because it differs from university to university, just like my colleague here was saying. In some instances, they simply see their role as just the educator. At the Clinton School, we see our role is definitely much more than that. And so the uniqueness of the effect that can be had on that community can depend on both the leadership that's at that university, how they perceive the community's presence. It can also depend on just where the people who are at that university come from. Do they come from the community? Are they all insurgents from out of state and out of, coming into it? So it could be a very unique effect. I'm a believer. My community organizing is still very near and dear to my heart. And so I always say that one of my best hires at the university is a community organizer. So in that context, I'm looking for folks who do that kind of work. So that's my word, unique.
Unique.
I'm not sure if this is grammatically correct, but I'm going to say a hopeful effect.
Universities have a hopeful effect on community.
Yeah, so I know that I've been a little skeptical, but I will say I think universities still, studies are showing that maybe that's shifting the way that people perceive the value of a higher education. But I do think that particularly in the communities we're talking about, they still very much believe in the hope and promise of what education can do for them, what it can do for the community. On this other level, I think community organizations have a hopeful, I think anytime a university calls them or says we want to send, there's always that hope that's there that this could be the one where they're going to stay with us and we're going to do the right thing. So I think it's a hopeful effect. I think there's always that promise of this, university that's going to be our partner and that it's also going to help my family move in a direction that'll change our outcomes.
Y'all are nice.
I could have said other things, but I was
I'm stuck between two words. The first word that I thought of was differential. The second word that I thought of was colonizing.
Banks is honest.
Differential, I thought about because it depends on which segment of the community you're talking about.
Yours.
Universities, I guess we ought to say which universities you're talking about too. Because one of the interesting things, this is when I moved to Winston-Salem State, this is my first time I've ever lived in the South. And it's the first time that I've been in a community that's had two very different universities. And the impact of Wake Forest on the community that I call my community is very different than the impact of Winston-Salem State on my community. And so some of those things are good at both schools, and some of them are really detrimental. But I think that over the years, this is my 29th year as an academic now, and one of the things that frightens me is the way that universities colonize the minds of particularly people who come from communities where poverty and disenfranchisement have been a problem, so that so many of our students who went to school initially to get a job, to give back to their communities, by the time they get their doctorates, have been so socialized that they're useless to their communities because and particularly if you work in university, the things that you have to do to stay in university takes you so far away if you're not constantly having someone pushing you to stay connected in order to be a success. So that we really need to start to do interventions to really think about how do we decolonize our students.
Thank you. One of my goals there was to keep that question purposely broad because I think there's a lot of opportunity to think about the role of university and to interpret what university is. And one thing that is inherently true in a lot of universities is that the people who are at a university or a college oftentimes tend to be transient. Right? The students are there for oftentimes a short period of time, the faculty, even a lot of times the folks who run the university. But of course, the community that surrounds the university tend to be folks who can be there for a lifetime. So can a group of folks who are inherently transient truly commit themselves and commit an institution to a group of people who are there not just for one lifetime, but oftentimes for generations?
Well, it would take unique thinking and innovative approaches to do that. Because not only are people at universities transient, the whole concept of a class or a semester starts and stops, right? And I know one of the things we want to lift up from this panel is potential models of how you partner in a different way with these universities, especially if you want to drive change, which is one of the things I think we've all kind of talked about here. So one of the models that we're exploring, it's not the only model, is this idea of the Center on Community Philanthropy, because it represents an opportunity for there to be a stick and stay component at the university that's committed to a community. Because even when you have field service projects or you have service learning projects where students go into a community and do something, when the project's over, they're gone. When the semester ends, the project's over with. And oftentimes, that is just a start, if that. So I'm going to give you an example of one of the things that's embedded in our curriculum is this idea of field service, where the students do 3 semesters of field service. They come in the first year, they do a practicum project, and they were working in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. I don't know if anybody knows that city. It's a city with a long history of systemic poverty, big problems with racial divide, poor education outcomes. And so they did their practicum, they got their grades, and they was out, right? But the students came to me and they said, Dr. Williams, we're done with this project, but Pine Bluff is still reeling with all the issues that they were having when we got there. And I said to them, well, have I got something for you? So that launched a 7-year project that we've been working on in Pine Bluff that began with a student project, and when they left and moved on to other projects and everything, we remained committed to working with those local people in Pine Bluff, convening them around the things that matter to them, helping in instances for seed dollars to get there, but beyond just the seed dollars, to help them organize and understand the resources that were circulating within their community and how to further build on that. And then as they decided what the priorities were for Pine Bluff, how can we continue to partner and stay committed to them in a long-term way? Not just study them, like you said, and print up a report about them, but how do we convene them around issues that matter to them? An example in this case was race and media. We took that on as a center for an entire year, committing to bringing in experts to talk about it, to convening local leaders to have dialogue about how you change it, and educating the community about their power and bringing their voice there on race and media. So fast forward, and that took some time now. You can't do that in a semester or two. Fast forward, 5 years later, we had the police department in Pine Bluff make the decision that they were going to rethink how they define individuals that have been arrested, how they give out the physical characteristics of them when they get arrested in articles and in media. Now that's an example, but it took some time to work with the folks in the community. They had to prioritize it and adopt it as an issue. So it's unique, but it's an example. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely possible. There are examples in North Carolina, but you have to be committed to creating a structure, and you have to be committed to having a leadership avenue for the neighborhood, because they're going to stay. And so even if different classes come or different folks are there, the process will continue. I think you also have to have a champion, like a faculty champion often, because they're the one who's going to broker what's going on. So example I'm thinking of is the Jackson Center that UNC Chapel Hill has created. Interestingly, it is now spun off into a nonprofit because they realize for true sustainability, it's better for it to be owned and stationed in the neighborhood. But it started out 13 years ago. A communications professor wanted to do oral histories. They started doing these oral histories, collecting these archives. It's a predominantly Black, predominantly African-American community. And the average age there is 77. So these were stories that were going to be lost if this wasn't happening. Well, as the students began to hear these stories, they began to realize that these homeowners were being threatened by the university, who was expanding into that area, and they started to think about what can we do to empower the neighborhood so that that doesn't happen to them. So they've, over time, there's lots of things that have happened, but one thing they did was they created a land bank with the city, with self-help, and believe it or not, with $3 million from the university, which is irony at its best, potentially. But it is a profound commitment that they made. But what they're doing is whenever a house would become available, developers would swoop in and make it student housing. So now with this land bank, they can now get these houses, hold them, and resell them to people in or from the community, and a lot of people are returning back to the north side who had not lived there. They're also giving loans for home repair. There's all sorts of things that have happened as a result of a service learning project in a class about oral histories. They now have an oral history bank of 150 of those stories. There's an archive. They have a radio program for youth in the neighborhood who collect stories and who report those out on the NPR station. So I think that there are models of it, but it requires someone who's going to stay the course. Della Pollock is the professor there who's leading the way, and she's doing it. She started out with a pastor at a local CME church, and he wasn't going to let it go either, so you've got to have all of that. But they also have leadership structures. The community leads the way. She has a word for it, but they actually have a title, that they're the leader. And so any student that comes in, any faculty that comes in knows this is the voice that we honor, not the university's voice.
Just a couple of things. I think that recognizing that different people are at places for different seasons. And so what their roles will be different. I say that as a person, this is my last year here. And so this is real personal to me. But one of the things that I've noticed as I talk to people at Winston-Salem State is that the staff have been there. This is their community. They're retiring from there. And so beginning to think about how do we engage staff in different ways. around these projects because that will help. And then thinking about how do we use faculty or people who are more transient as consultants to communities, so that the skills that we have, they can run with them. I think that.
Do we have audience questions? All right, so before we take audience questions, I'm going to take just a point of moderator privilege and tell a quick story. Before I came to Winston-Salem, I was in New Orleans, and I was running an organization called the New Orleans Fair Housing Center. We did an awful lot of community work. We were basically a nonprofit law firm, and we had a love-hate relationship with the universities in our community. On one hand, we would get invited to meetings at Tulane University, Loyola University, the University of New Orleans, and Xavier University, and sometimes those meetings would go on and on and on and on, and nothing would come of them. And so when I think about that sentence, a university has, I would say, a time-wasting effect on community in those circumstances. But other times, I would meet with Loyola University, particularly the law school, and they'd say, well, we are ready to put our, and this is also the Tulane University Law School, we'll put our law school students on your cases and help you litigate, and then they helped us win some of the most important cases that we ever won. As a matter of fact, we won hundreds of thousands of dollars on behalf of victims of housing discrimination. One of the cases that I'm most proud of is a case where we were able to help a woman who had been sexually harassed by the maintenance man at her public housing development. And we were able to win an amount that I can't say because it's restricted in the settlement agreement, but I can say that she no longer lives in public housing because she was able to buy her own home. Right? And it was only because of that partnership with university. And so in that circumstance, I'd say university has a life-changing effect on community. But I was always skeptical. So skeptical that after Hurricane Katrina, when I served on the board of directors of the National Fair Housing Alliance, the organization was looking for a speaker for their national conference in the city of New Orleans. And so they identified a Princeton professor to come speak about Hurricane Katrina. And I said, how dare you invite a Princeton professor to come speak to New Orleanians and to fair housing advocates about Hurricane Katrina? And they said, well, she has amazing data and she's researched it, and at least look at her data and her reports. And I said, well, I'm too busy dealing with the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. I don't, no, stop, don't invite her. And we have amazing universities here. Let's get someone from Tulane or from Loyola, or let's use some of our own research. They invited her anyway. They said, shut up, James, we're bringing her here. So I was prepared at that event to, of course, boycott her event or to at least say some really negative things during the question and answer period. But Melissa presented her data, and at that time, Melissa Harris Lacewell presented her data, and needless to say, that her data was amazing, and it made all of us rethink the way that people who experienced Katrina were presented and acknowledged by the media. And within 14 days, I used that data to go back and rethink all of what we had to say to the media, and it completely repositioned our organization, right? Needless to say, I also called, emailed, text messaged, Facebook, and tweeted Dr. Harris Lacewell, also known as stalking. And so in that case, I might say that, university creates relationships, perhaps called marriage, right, for those of us in community. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and open it up to those of you who have questions, with the hopes that you can also make some community.
My name is Net Majuka, and I'm just a mom, but I'm a mom who reads a lot. So, taken with your example of the law school, coming in and helping with cases and helping you win a lot of cases. And my brother, the PhD at University of Chicago, and while they were doing their clinical rotations, they went to the hospital right there and worked with patients. So there was like a mutually beneficial relationship there. The young doctors and residents and everything worked with the hospital. So they both got something for it, so to speak. Now fast forward years later, and I at a book.
Cuts in and out, you gotta keep going.
Okay, I'm just gonna yell. So I was at a book club with my like making a lot of money, young one, white, of course. And this man starts telling how he grew up in New Jersey. And he said, well, there's no poor people in New Jersey. That's the face I made. Well, meanwhile, I'm like, what? And my daughter now, just like Marianne does, she's grabbing my thigh. Like, Mom, he's my colleague, I have to work with him, so. But I'm like, well, I happen to teach in a Catholic school right near Newark. Like, do you know about Newark? And he honestly was perplexed. He couldn't even believe I was challenging him. So my question is, what can anyone do when you're talking about schools of business, and because the trend has been more towards parents wanting their kids to go to business school so they can make money and all that, and now these people are coming out and they're going to be our leaders, and some of them are so clueless. So what are your recommendations for, in a non-threatening way to raise awareness
Got it.
for white people?
Panel?
So I would say that that's a perfect case study for why campuses do need to do community engagement. I will say this, though, that I think it has to be done with preparation. So Dr. Tanaya Mitchell out in Stanford is about to release a study where she has asked, I want to say, over 1,000 faculty from campuses all over the country to submit to her their syllabi. And she has analyzed them, and I want to say less than 5% of them had any readings, any requirements that had anything to do with equity, with race, with anything. So what she was finding was that even the faculty that are doing it are sending students out into communities that they may not know anything about. They may not understand poverty, race, anything, without really helping them understand historical context, what's going on currently. So I think that we need to do more. I will say one of the weakest places where this happens is in business schools, unfortunately. There's more happening now, but we're calling it social entrepreneurship, which may not necessarily be as grounded in social justice as it needs to be, but at least it's starting to happen. But I think that that's a case, that's a reason why campuses need to do more in the community in terms of their courses and helping people see the reality of what they're learning in the world.
I want to actually jump in on this because, in part because I'm so interested in the the piece around philanthropy connected to also the conversation that was happening a bit on funding of organizations, both within and outside. And so I actually want to step back a little bit from the idea that sort of business majors are the problem. Oh, no, I know you didn't, but I think it's, yeah, yes, right. So let me, I'm not saying that you said that, I'm saying it's easy for us to move in that direction. So if we go to the idea in part that one of the few times that universities tend to not be time wasters, but sort of immediate problem solvers is when we get to the professional schools, right? Who are sort of less interested in up here and more in like, all right, what are we gonna do? So our medical schools, our law schools will say, we're gonna put law students on your team and go solve, this problem. So one of the words I hadn't heard yet today was entrepreneurship. And on our very first day, on Thursday, when we were in conversation about equity, one of the words I was trying to introduce was not only responsibility, certainly responsibility, but also incentives. So how can we think about both the responsibilities that a university has, but also the incentives, so that we are remembering that all institutions and individuals will operate relative to incentives. So one of the things I'd love to hear from all of you, but especially relative to both how Campus Compact is thinking about getting both students and universities who might be the not usual suspects to be engaged, and also as you're rethinking what philanthropy looks like, which is part of what's happening, or at least part of what we're trying to do on our campus as well. I'd really love to hear about entrepreneurship as part of this. And even if we're talking about social entrepreneurship, so then what would those models look like? I also don't want us to be, any of us, to be waiting on the funding priorities of national or local philanthropies as they have been narrowly and traditionally defined. I would really like to think about how you make money in ways that are consistent with the values of your organization, how you create resources that contribute back to scholarship and contribute to broadening the resources that are available. And just if any thoughts have been engaged with that.
She's handing me the mic, okay. Well, I have a few that I can mention. Let me start with the idea of incentives. As I mentioned already, a core focus of the work of the Center on Community Philanthropy is based in this idea of advancing racial equity, addressing racial healing, and how community philanthropy can be brought to bear on that. I already talked about how we define community philanthropy as giving a time, talent, and treasure, that when you invest it locally, is characteristic of positive change and lasting development. So in the context of racial equity, we're exploring how do people give their time, talent, and treasure to eliminate disparities? And what does that look like? How do you have dialogue on purpose, intentionally, without shutting down the conversation, without getting angry? And we believe we can do that by utilizing certain terminology like disparities and inequities, because it focuses on the data and not on the person. So one of the incentives that I was just sharing Mr. Perry about, that we're getting ready to roll out, is our Advancing Racial Equity Award. It's an award that the center will be, an award scholarship the center will be giving to young leaders of color or young women who are doing innovative things locally to bring about peace and to advance racial equity. Now that's how we started the incentive. But after Charlottesville, I sought to increase that award and to broaden it to also include community organizations and community groups that might be working without recognition or who may be tirelessly working locally to try to advance racial equity. And so we will now be giving that award, and we've tripled the dollar amount. So it's not only going to a person, it's also going to an organization. So that's just one example of how we're doing that. I'll let somebody else give another example.
You all know I play in healthcare. And so with respect to that, some of the things that I've been thinking about is that we have a lot of people who are unpaid and underpaid providers of care for people with various health issues. And so I think there's a tremendous opportunity. I started off life as a student at Purdue in biomedical engineering. And at this point, I'm thinking I can go back. But I think that there are a lot of people with limited resources who have had to be real creative in terms of setting up houses and getting the little tools and equipment so that their family can have some semblance. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for us to develop programs where we're taking people from the community to develop the technology and to develop the equipment and to be on the forefront of how do you redo houses. So there's so many applications around health that I think we haven't begun to explore. We're doing things with engineering, working with the healthcare people, but I really think we need to get out and look at the entrepreneurial opportunities around health.
We've got one more question here in the back.
Can I just quickly say, the inherent difficulty here is convincing universities to give away the thing that they sell. Right? So, in a community that, for instance, has difficulties with poverty and needs more money, the thing that a student is paying for in the business school is a skill that people in that community need. Right? And so transferring those skills to people in that community so that they can engage in entrepreneurism in that community is an incredible opportunity. And it's one that the nonprofits can benefit from and that the people in the community can benefit from. But but what incentive is there for the university to transfer that skill? And there's a lot of incentive, but it is hard to convince a university to do that. Not just because of, I mean, it's a difficult resource issue. So,
Can I speak to that? We have an example of how we're working to do that, because you're absolutely right. Pine Bluff chose race and media. That was their issue. But as you know, communities have different issues that they want to work on. In Helena, West Helena, Arkansas, it was poverty. There's been so much systemic generational poverty that that's what they wanted to address. So we began working with an African-American female named Patricia Ashante. When we met her, she was working out of her kitchen table, doing classes. You've probably heard the Bridges Out of Poverty curriculum, and working with people around behavioral change, around how you move beyond the conditions of poverty. Well, we began working with her to help build her capacity for doing that. We helped her with strategic planning. We helped her to build her business into an official nonprofit. So now we helped with her branding. Her organization is now called Delta Circles. She has moved from a sole proprietor. She was very entrepreneurial in her work. She wanted to do this for mothers, single mothers, families, to help them understand how we change behavior. How do you move successfully through that curriculum, and financial literacy to move yourself beyond conditions of, but she needed resources from us to do that. She now has a 501c3. She's a nonprofit. Delta Circles has now competed for and received Walmart funding. They received their own WRF funding. She's really moving to a place to where she's doing this locally and impacting more women. And she sent me an email since I've been at this conference that she's planning to apply to the Clinton School for the master's program.
There you go.
So,
All right. So our question in the back, and then we're going to try to answer very, very quickly so that we can conclude our overtime session here.
In Winston-Salem,
can't hear you.
There. I did not picture this morning across the room. That's okay. So there are 500 nonprofits in Forsyth County. And with the way that funding is set up, funding goes to the 501c3s. It doesn't go to community directly. So how do community organizers get funders to understand that the way that they're operating and saying that we have to give you this money, but you have to complete these things in grants, and those grants have to be turned in before most nonprofits even engage with community. How do people who live in the community, who want to be organizers, approach funders in a way that says that I really just want to change my community because I live here, not because I have to meet the terms of my mission statement or whatever? How do we do that? How do we change that model that people on the ground who live in community can actually become the people who are changing their own communities?
Okay, well, let me first say we are not a funder. The Center on Community Philanthropy is not a funder. I tell people all the time, and a way to think about it, if you go to the Center for Substance Abuse, they don't give you drugs, right? If you come to the Center on Community Philanthropy, we don't give you grants. We give you knowledge about how to understand this kind of philanthropy. So we're not a funder. We work with funders, but we believe in partnership. And through partnership, there's a lot of different ways that you can exchange the resources and leverage the resources so that local folks are engaged in getting and being a part of the kind of change that they want to see happen. But I am not a foundation. We ourselves do not do funding, but we very much believe in partnering with organizations, helping resources get to both individuals who are doing the change, but individuals need to leverage, they need to partner, they need to collaborate. You can achieve more when you're working together than working in isolation. So that's one of the things I would lift up with that.
I think the other thing is this is a great opportunity for university folk to be helpful in that I'm part of a group, we're changing our name, and I can't remember the new name, but the old name was the African American Collaborative Obesity Research Network. And one of the most important things that we did was get into those rooms so that beginning to talk to the funders about how the funding mechanisms themselves are problematic, and to look at how do you shift the conversation around the paradigms that are being used. And so I think that this is a real opportunity for those of us to do what I say is use your power. And that's one thing that universities have is power to speak to a lot of the organizations. But what it means is that we have to begin to increase the number of people within the universities who are committed to the community first. And so that's another part of how we're going to do that, because the funding mechanisms need to change to allow that.
And so I agree that the funding mechanisms and structures really do need to change, but I also agree that the universities can be your ally in that. But I would also encourage you to look at these, I don't know what they're called, but they're popping up all around, and it's sort of local giving groups. Like there's one in Giving Circles, yeah, in Greensboro, yeah, a women's, and so they're giving it to just things that they care about. Because I've been part of organizations that have even applied, or individuals can apply, and they're passionate about outcomes for women and girls. And so I would encourage you to look around at these giving circles that are not tied to these big foundations and others who have, the long applications and all these outcomes and logic models and all of that. So I would encourage you to do that.
Yeah, there's a huge one here. Giving circles are a form of community philanthropy. There's one here called the Sister Circle. It comes through the Community Investment Network. Yeah.
I'd add two things. One is, just speaking very frankly, the giving process for foundations has a bit of a quid pro quo in that it is this idea that when folks give to a foundation or give to a nonprofit, they get a tax deduction, a charitable tax deduction. And so it is inherently designed so that you don't give to an entity that doesn't help you with your taxes, right? And so it does create a problem for someone who is simply working in an earnest and moral fashion to do good work. It is really easy to get looked over. And it's unfortunate but true, and it doesn't seem like that's going to change anytime soon. But one solution to that is to partner with an and I think that's what's inherent in the answers that you've heard, is to partner with an organization who does have 501c3 status, who's willing to sponsor or support or accept and then transfer funds to you. And there are lots of organizations that are willing to do that. And I'm here at the Urban League, and I'd be happy to have a conversation with you offline and to talk about a process for helping and supporting. So with that, I'd ask you to thank our incredible panelists.